Before Kirk Franklin and Mary became household names, there were trailblazing gospel groups in the 70s and 80s who laid the foundation, but somehow slipped through the cracks of mainstream memory. From the voices that filled churches to those who dominated local radio, here are the 15 underrated gospel groups from the 70s and 80s that you probably forgot existed, but definitely shouldn't have. 1. The Williams Brothers. Long before they became household names in the 90s with their smooth contemporary gospel sound, the Williams Brothers were grinding it out in the 70s and 80s with some of the grittiest, most soulful harmonies you've ever heard. Back then, they weren't polished studio darlings. They were raw, hungry, and absolutely electric. The group started in Smithdale, Mississippi, where brothers Doug, Leonard, Melvin, and Henry Williams grew up singing in their father's church. Their early sound was pure Southern gospel fire, with Leonard's piercing lead vocals cutting through the mix like a hot knife through butter. Songs like Jesus Will Fix It and I'm Just a Nobody showcased their ability to take traditional gospel themes and inject them with an urgency that made you forget you were sitting in church. What made them special during this era was their willingness to get messy with their music. They would stretch notes until they cracked, harmonize until their voices bled together, and create moments of pure spiritual chaos that somehow resolved into perfect musical sense. Leonard's voice could go from a whisper to a wail in half a second, while Doug's bass lines anchored everything with the steadiness of a heartbeat. Their live performances were legendary in the South. They would show up at small churches and turn the place upside down with their energy. People would drive for hours just to hear them sing Cooling Water or Sweep Around Your Own Front Door. The brothers had this way of making every song feel like a personal conversation between them and God, with the audience lucky enough to eavesdrop. The crazy thing is, they were recording albums throughout the 70s and 80s, but most folks only discovered them when they hit it big later. Those early records captured something special, a sound that was equal parts Mississippi Delta blues, traditional quartet singing, and pure Holy Ghost fire. 2. The Jackson Southerners. If you wanted to hear what gospel quartet singing was supposed to sound like, you listened to the Jackson Southerners. These guys out of Jackson, Mississippi, had voices so deep and rich you could practically swim in them. Their sound was like aged whiskey, smooth, warm, and with just enough burn to remind you it was the real deal. The group formed in the early 60s, but their 70s and 80s work was when they really hit their stride. What set them apart was their restraint. While other groups were getting flashy and experimental, the Jackson Southerners kept things pure and simple. They would take a hymn that everyone knew and sing it so beautifully that you'd swear you were hearing it for the first time. Their harmonies were architectural, every voice had its place, and together they built something bigger than the sum of their parts. They toured constantly during this period, often playing second or third on bills headlined by bigger names. But smart gospel fans knew to stick around for their set. They had this way of closing out a show that left audiences stunned and satisfied. Songs like He Keeps on Blessing Me and Hooked on Jesus became their calling cards, and they would perform them with such conviction that even the most skeptical listeners became believers. The group recorded several albums during this era, mostly for smaller labels that didn't have the distribution power of the major companies. That's part of why they're forgotten now. Their music was always harder to find than it should have been. But those who knew, knew. Gospel DJs would spin their records late at night, and churches would book them for special occasions when they wanted to guarantee the Spirit would move. 3. The Gospel Keynotes. Willie Neal Johnson was destined for gospel greatness, but before he became a solo sensation, he was part of the Gospel Keynotes, and their work in the 70s was absolutely incredible. This Brooklyn-based group combined traditional quartet singing with an urban sophistication that made them stand out from their southern counterparts. Johnson's voice was already something special. It had this quality that could make you laugh and cry at the same time. When he sang lead on songs like Jesus Loves Me or Jesus You've Been Good to Me, you could hear both joy and pain in every note. But what made the gospel keynotes work was how well the other members supported his vocals. They created a foundation that let Johnson soar without ever making it feel like a one-man show. The group had this knack for taking familiar songs and finding new pockets of emotion in them. Their version of Amazing Grace started quiet and built slowly, layer by layer, until it became this overwhelming wall of sound that would leave audiences breathless. They understood that gospel music was about the journey as much as the destination. They recorded several albums during this period, often for small independent labels that specialized in gospel music. Their production values weren't always perfect. You could sometimes hear the studio's air conditioning humming in the background, but that rawness was part of their charm. These were real people singing real songs about real faith, not polished performers trying to manufacture emotion. Live, they were something else entirely. Johnson would work the crowd like a master preacher, building tension and release with his vocals, while the rest of the group provided the perfect soundtrack to his spiritual theater. 4. The Fantastic Violinaires. Detroit in the 70s and 80s was a city in transition, and the Fantastic Violinaires captured that energy perfectly. They took traditional gospel quartet singing and gave it an urban edge that reflected the Motor City's blue-collar soul. These guys understood that gospel music could be both sacred and street smart. The group was built around the powerful lead vocals of Wilson Pickett, not the famous R&B singer, but a gospel vocalist who could match that Pickett's intensity note for note. Songs like Dr. Jesus and Lord, I'm Coming Back became their signature pieces, performed with an energy that could light up any room. What made them special was their stage presence. These weren't guys who stood still and sang pretty. They moved, they gestured, they made every song feel like a performance art piece. They understood that gospel music was about communication as much as vocal technique, and they communicated with their whole bodies. They often served as opening acts for bigger gospel names touring through Detroit, and smart audiences would show up early to catch their set. They had this ability to warm up a crowd that made headliners grateful to have them on the bill. The Fantastic Violinaires recorded several albums during this era, mostly for regional labels that served the Midwest gospel market. Their records captured some of their live energy, but you really had to see them perform to understand what they were about. They were proof that gospel music could be both deeply spiritual and absolutely electric. 5. The Truthettes. In a gospel world dominated by male quartets, the Truthettes were something completely different. A female group that sang with the power and conviction of any male quartet, but with harmonies that could make angels weep. These Chicago-based ladies proved that gospel music didn't have gender boundaries when it came to moving hearts and souls. Their sound was bluesy in the best possible way. Their harmonies had this quality that reminded you that gospel music came from the same place as the blues, from people who had seen trouble but hadn't given up on joy. The group formed in the late 60s but really hit their stride in the 70s and 80s. They toured constantly, often as the only female act on bills full of male quartets. That could have been intimidating, but the Truthettes held their own every single night. They recorded several albums during this period, working with small labels that specialized in traditional gospel music. Their production was always clean, but never sterile. You could hear the passion in every note, the conviction in every harmony. These were women who had lived their songs before they sang them. 6. The Sensational Nightingales. By the 70s, the Sensational Nightingales had already been around for decades, but age hadn't slowed them down. It had deepened their sound. Hailing from North Carolina, they were among the few groups that managed to maintain both traditional gospel integrity and mass appeal over decades of musical changes. Known for their smooth harmonies, spirited lead vocals, and unwavering dedication to the message of the gospel, the Sensational Nightingales were a major force in shaping what many now call the golden era of quartet gospel. The group's most iconic lineup included Julius Cheeks, a vocal powerhouse whose raw, passionate delivery made every lyric feel like a sermon. Even after Cheeks left and returned at different points, the group never lost its momentum. During the 1970s and 80s, They continued to record and tour, releasing songs that resonated with both older gospel audiences and younger fans who appreciated authentic quartet singing. What made the sensational Nightingales such a big deal during those decades was their ability to make you feel something real. Their performances were more than just music. They were experiences. The blend of deep baritone, soaring tenor, and driving rhythm gave their songs an energy that few could match. While gospel was evolving with more contemporary acts, the Nightingales stood firm in their traditional sound, and that's exactly what kept fans loyal. One of their most unforgettable songs is "It's Gonna Rain." The song is a powerful warning that echoes the days of Noah and urges listeners to get their spiritual house in order. The song's urgency and commanding vocals made it a church favorite and a staple in their live performances. The sensational Nightingales were more than just a group. They were a gospel institution. Even if some have forgotten their name, their sound helped define an era where gospel music meant conviction, storytelling, and deep soul-saving power. 7. The Soul Stirrers. Everyone knows the Soul Stirrers as Sam Cooke's launching pad, but the group that continued after Cooke left was something special in its own right. The 70s and 80s Soul Stirrers proved that great gospel groups could survive the loss of even their most famous members by staying true to the music that made them great in the first place. The group's sound during this era was both traditional and forward-looking. They kept the classic Soul Stirrers harmonies that had made them famous, but they also incorporated some of the musical innovations that were happening in gospel music during the 70s and 80s. Songs like "Be With Me, Jesus, and Stand By Me" Father felt both timeless and contemporary. They toured constantly during this period, often playing for audiences who came expecting to hear Sam Cooke and left impressed by what they heard instead. The group understood that they were carrying on a tradition, but they also knew that tradition only stays alive when it keeps growing. Their recordings from this era captured a group that was confident in their own identity. They weren't trying to recreate their past glories. They were busy creating new ones. 8. The Swanee Quintet. Raw, unpolished, and absolutely authentic. The Swanee Quintet represented everything that was beautiful about grassroots gospel music. These guys didn't have the smoothest harmonies or the most polished stage presence, but what they had was something that couldn't be taught. Genuine spiritual fire that burned through every song they sang. Their sound was pure church, the kind of music that got sung in small sanctuaries where the Spirit moved freely and people weren't afraid to let their emotions show. Lead singer Percy Griffin had a voice that cracked and soared in equal measure, but every crack felt intentional. Every note felt necessary. When he sang "Ups and Downs, God's or God Will Provide," you believed every word. The group's energy was infectious. They would perform songs like "Jesus is a Rock" or "How Much Do I Owe Him" with such enthusiasm that audiences couldn't help but get caught up in the moment. Their harmonies weren't perfect, but they were honest. And in gospel music, honesty trumps perfection every time. They recorded several albums during the 70s and 80s, mostly for small labels that specialized in traditional gospel music. Their production values were minimal. Sometimes it sounded like they were recording in someone's living room. But that intimacy was part of their appeal. These were real people singing real songs about real faith. 9. The Christian Trailblazers. Smooth, sophisticated, and deeply soulful, the Christian Aries represented the more polished side of 70s and 80s gospel music. While some groups were going for raw energy, these guys perfected a sound that was both spiritually powerful and musically refined. They proved that you could be smooth without being shallow. Their harmonies were architectural masterpieces. Every voice had its place. Every note served the whole, and together they created something that was bigger than the sum of its parts. The group's repertoire during this era included both traditional hymns and more contemporary gospel songs. Their live shows were polished but never cold. They understood that technique was only valuable if it served the spirit of the music. Songs like "Let God Fix It" and "Look to Jesus" became showcase pieces that demonstrated both their vocal abilities and their spiritual commitment. The Christianaires recorded several albums during this period, working with labels that specialized in traditional gospel music. Their studio work captured their vocal precision and musical sophistication, creating records that sounded great on both church sound systems and home stereos. 10. The Highway QCs. The Highway QCs were gospel music royalty by the 70s and 80s, but somehow their work from this era gets overshadowed by their earlier fame as the launching pad for Sam Cooke and Lou Rawls. That's a shame, because the group that continued making music through these decades was still capable of creating moments of pure gospel magic. Their sound during this era was a perfect blend of their classic quartet roots and the musical innovations that were happening in gospel music during the 70s and 80s. They kept the tight harmonies and spiritual intensity that had made them famous, but they also incorporated some contemporary elements that kept their music feeling fresh and relevant. Lead singers came and went during this period, but the group's commitment to musical excellence never wavered. Whether they were performing Amazing Grace or He's Coming Back Again, they brought the same level of passion and precision that had made them legends in the first place. Their harmonies remained some of the best in gospel music, with each voice perfectly placed to support the whole. They continued touring during this era, often headlining gospel programs where they would share bills with both established stars and up-and-coming groups. Their experience showed in their stage presence. They knew how to work a crowd, how to build energy, and how to leave audiences satisfied but wanting more. 11. The O'Neill Twins. The O'Neill Twins started singing in church when they were just kids, and by the time the 70s rolled around, they were creating some of the most beautiful gospel music you've ever heard. The Twins had this special way of blending their voices that made you feel like you were floating on a cloud. When they sang songs like Jesus Dropped the Charges and He Chose Me, it wasn't just music. It was pure emotion wrapped up in perfect harmony. Edward would take the lead on most songs, his voice smooth as butter, while Edgar would weave in these incredible harmonies that made your spine tingle. What made them really special was how they could take a simple gospel song and turn it into something that felt brand new. They weren't trying to be flashy or show off. They just sang from their hearts, and somehow that made everything sound more real. Their album, Saved by His Love, became a favorite in churches across the country, but somehow never got the radio play it deserved. The brothers grew up in a house where gospel music was always playing. Their mother was a church pianist, and their father sang in the choir, so music was literally in their blood. By the time they were teenagers, they were already performing at local churches and gospel programs around Detroit. People would drive from other cities just to hear them sing. Their recording career started when a small gospel label heard them performing at a church concert. The label owner was so impressed that he signed them on the spot. Their first album came out in 1970, and it was like nothing people had heard before. The production was simple, just their voices, some light piano, and maybe a little organ, but the emotion was huge. 12. The Pilgrim Jubilees. Now here's a group that gospel fans know, but everybody else seems to have forgotten. The Pilgrim Jubilees were like the Rolling Stones of gospel quartets. They could get a crowd going like nobody's business. These guys from Mississippi didn't just sing gospel, they performed it with every bone in their bodies. Clay Graham was their secret weapon. This man could sing lead vocals that would make you jump out of your seat, and when he got going, there was no stopping him. Songs like God's Been Good to Me and Don't Let Him Down became instant classics in the gospel world. Clay had this way of building up a song that started quiet and gentle, then exploded into pure energy that had people shouting and dancing in the aisles. The group formed way back in the 1930s, but their real golden period was the 70s and early 80s. They were touring constantly, playing at churches, gospel festivals, and anywhere people wanted to hear real, authentic gospel music. Their live shows were legendary. They would come out in matching suits, Clay would grab the microphone, and for the next hour, it was pure gospel magic. What set them apart was their showmanship. These weren't just singers standing behind microphones. They were entertainers who knew how to work a crowd. Clay would get down on his knees, run through the audience, and sometimes even climb on chairs while he sang. The other members, Major Robertson, Cleve Graham, and Ben Chandler, would provide these incredible vocal arrangements that sounded like they were having a conversation with each other. Their album, Trouble in the Street, became a classic in gospel circles. The title track was this driving, rhythmic song that showcased everything great about the group: Clay's powerful lead vocals, the tight harmonies, and that infectious energy that made you want to move. Radio DJs loved playing their records because they knew people would call in asking who that was. The Pilgrim Jubilees were also pioneers in taking gospel music to new places. They were one of the first quartet groups to really embrace a more contemporary sound while still keeping their traditional roots. They would add electric guitars and drums to their arrangements, but never lost that pure gospel feeling that made them special. 13. The Davis Sisters. The Davis Sisters were a groundbreaking gospel group whose powerful voices and emotional delivery left a deep mark on gospel music, especially during the 1950s and 60s. But even into the 1970s and 80s, their music continued to inspire and influence both fans and upcoming gospel artists. Formed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the original group was made up of Ruth Baby Sis Davis and her sisters. Though later on, non-family members joined the lineup. Ruth Davis was the heart of the group, known for her raw, soul-stirring vocals that could move a crowd like few others. What made the Davis Sisters such a big deal wasn't just their music. It was the feeling behind it. Their songs were full of deep faith, pain, hope, and joy. They didn't perform gospel music to entertain. They sang to testify. Their style was rooted in traditional gospel, but it carried the emotional weight of the blues and the passion of Pentecostal worship. While they gained early fame in the 1950s, many of their songs remained popular well into the 70s and 80s, especially during the gospel revivals that brought older music back to the spotlight. One of their standout tracks was 12 Gates to the City, a classic gospel tune that showcased their tight harmonies and commanding stage presence. The song became one of their signature hits and was often requested at concerts and radio stations. Another powerful track was Lord Don't Leave Me, a deep, soul-touching number that reminded listeners of the importance of faith and waiting on God's timing. These songs weren't just enjoyed in church settings, they were heard in homes, on the radio, and at revival events across the country. Even though gospel music began to evolve with newer artists and styles in the 70s and 80s, the Davis Sisters' legacy never faded. Younger gospel singers continued to study their music, trying to capture even a fraction of their spirit. Their ability to blend pain and praise in every note made them unforgettable. Though some may have forgotten their name, the Davis Sisters helped shape gospel music into what it became during those decades, full of power, passion, and the unshakable hope found in every note. 14. The Mighty Clouds of Joy. Everybody knows the Mighty Clouds of Joy, right? They had those big hits in the 70s, won Grammy Awards, and got played on R&B radio stations. But here's what people don't remember: their early 80s period when they went completely experimental and created some of the most innovative gospel music of the decade. Joe Ligon was still leading the group with that incredible voice of his, but by the early 80s, oh geez, they were adding funk bass lines, rock guitar solos, and synthesizers to their gospel sound. Songs like Mighty High and Family Circle sounded like they could have been on the radio next to Prince or Earth, Wind and Fire, but they were still pure gospel at their core. This was risky stuff for a gospel group. Traditional gospel fans weren't sure what to make of these new sounds, and secular audiences weren't sure if they should be listening to gospel music. But the Mighty Clouds didn't care. They were making the music they wanted to make, and it was brilliant. The group's willingness to experiment came from their confidence in their abilities. They had been performing since the 1960s and had already proven they could sing traditional gospel better than almost anybody, so why not try something new? Joe Ligon's voice was so powerful and distinctive that it could handle any style of music they threw at it. Their album Cloudburst was a perfect example of this experimental period. It had gospel songs with rock guitar solos, funk rhythms, and even some disco influences, but somehow it all worked because the group's core identity was so strong. They were still the mighty Clouds of Joy, just with a bigger, more modern sound. 15. The Meditation Singers. Here's a group that should be way more famous than they are. The Meditation Singers were a trailblazing all-female gospel group that helped define the sound of traditional gospel music in the mid-20th century. Formed in Detroit, Michigan, in the late 1940s by Ernestine Rundles, the group was a spiritual powerhouse that brought fiery vocals, tight harmonies, and anointing to every stage they stepped on. Though they started in the 1940s, their influence carried well into the 1970s and 1980s, particularly among gospel fans who valued the pure church-based sound that the Meditation Singers never strayed from. One of the most notable members of the group in its early years was Della Reese, who joined at the age of 13. Though she later found mainstream success as a pop singer and actress, Della's gospel roots with the Meditation Singers laid the foundation for her career. When she left the group in the early 1950s, she was replaced by none other than Laura Lee, the daughter of Ernestine Rundles. Laura later went on to become a soul star in her own right during the 1970s, but her gospel foundation began with the Meditation Singers. The group was known for their soul-stirring performances and a sound that blended the deep emotion of traditional gospel with professional musicianship. They traveled extensively and were often featured on gospel programs and church circuits, keeping their name alive well into the 1980s. Two of their standout songs include Too Close to Heaven and God's Gonna Trouble the Water. The Meditation Singers may not be widely remembered by name today, but their legacy lives on in gospel history. They were pioneers, women of deep faith and vocal power who helped shape the gospel sound for generations to come. Which of these gospel groups brought back the most memories for you? Or maybe you just discovered a new favorite. Either way, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful throwbacks just like this. See you in the next video.